and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm George Binns, and as we mentioned the last time, we're doing a follow-up to the discussion with the Reverend Myozen Joan Amaral. Welcome back, Joan.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, the topic that we ended up with last week, the week before last, whenever it was talking about white privilege. And in the meantime, I sent you a email that I found online talking about a gentleman by the name of Shola Richards.
Yeah.
And the brief part of the story is that he is apparently a very large, I think he's mentioned 6'2", very athletic gentleman with a very dark tan. And he's apparently living in a rather upscale neighborhood. And he mentions that when he walks around the neighborhood, he always takes his daughter and the dog with him. And he goes on to explain that he wants to make sure that people understand that he belongs in the neighborhood and he is not a threat. And he goes on to some more extensively discussing what the issues really are. And I guess that's where you want to break in and pick your first topic.
Well, I think, maybe just because this is such a wonderful study to be doing together, George, and I really appreciate this. In Zen, the teaching of beginner's mind being fresh, being open, there's a sincerity to it, like a willingness to learn. And so me too, I think both you and I tonight, what we're doing is we're studying white privilege as two people who identify as white. One correction I want to make is that nowhere in this story does it ever say it was an upscale neighborhood that he lives in. It just simply says his Los Angeles neighborhood.
Yeah.
It's just the place where he lives, and he's lived there for years. So, and I think that's important. It's just a guy living in a neighborhood. It could be like Prospect Hill here in Beverly, or it could be like Ryleside, or it could be my neighborhood, downtown Beverly, on either side of Cabot Street. So maybe we should just give a little bit of background. He's 45 years old. He has two daughters, 11 years old and 8 years old. And he's talking about the reality of being a 6'2", athletically built Black man in the United States, and how that translates into his feeling scared to death to walk alone in his Los Angeles neighborhood. And he says, here's something I must admit. I would be scared to death to go for these walks that I like to do in my neighborhood without my girls and my dog. In fact, in the 4 years living in my house, I've never taken a walk around my neighborhood alone, and probably never will. And he says, sure, some of you may read that and think that I'm being melodramatic or that I'm playing the race card. I still have no clue what that means, but this is my reality. When I'm walking down the street holding my young daughter's hand and walking my sweet fluffy dog, I'm just a loving dad and pet owner, taking a break from the joylessness of crisis homeschooling. But he explains that without his daughter by his side, his presence could be perceived as menacing. Instantly, I morph into a threat in the eyes of some white folks. Instead of being a loving dad to two little girls, unfortunately, all that some people can see is a 6'2", athletically built Black man in a cloth mask who is walking around in a place where he doesn't belong, even though I'm still the same guy who just wants to take a walk through his neighborhood. It's equal parts exhausting and depressing to feel like I can't walk around outside alone for fear of being targeted. So the last thing I'll say is he adds here that if anyone is surprised by this, you shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. We live in a world where there is a sizable amount of people who actually believe that racism isn't a thing and that white privilege is a made-up fantasy to be politically correct. So the last time we spoke, George, and I'll remind us that you're the one who sent me this piece, that you thought it would be, that in preparing for our discussion, continuing conversation, white privilege came up last time and you wanted to study it. And so you thought that this would be helpful. Last time you also said you were one of these people that Shola is talking about. At least you said that racism doesn't exist because there is no race. How do you feel this week?
About the same. And again, my problem with this whole exercise, and that's not the only piece of paper I've uncovered. I got a whole stack of them here, different articles that are from lots of different perspectives. And that's one of my problems with this whole thing is it's hard to get a consistent story as to what are we really talking about. And some people say that white privilege exists and it's a problem. And other people say, what white privilege? And what's privileged about it? And one of the interesting articles I stumbled across is they talk about the concept of being a victim. And if you perceive yourself as a victim, you tend to act differently than if you feel much more comfortable and unmolested, kind of thing. And this whole business of race is a real problem. And I'm not sure what the real problem is. I know what the symptoms are. We're living through it right now with the riots and all the trauma that goes with them and the devastation and the various nasty things that are happening to lots of different people of all sorts of shapes and colors. So it's a very messy problem. And one of the other things that keeps coming out to me is lots of people have different ideas on how to fix it, but they never identify exactly what they're fixing. We have a solution. A solution to what? There has to be a correlation between the solution and the problem to believe it's going to work. So I'm still confused.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's worthwhile to keep this discussion going. I'm not sure where it's going to go.
Thank you.
But
well, thank you. So, you know, I'm a priest.
Yep.
And I'm a Zen priest. And I teach meditation. That's what I do as a Zen priest. And Zen people believe, the Buddha taught he taught one thing. The Buddha taught just one thing, and I've told you this before, suffering and the end of suffering. He taught that as one thing, that there is suffering in the world and there's a way to be free of it. But we're not free of it by ignoring it. You know, we're free of it by engaging with it, by acknowledging it and finding a way to work within our delusion, for instance. And, you know, I think one of the things about suffering, if I'm suffering, I don't want someone to call my suffering an issue. I want them to help me with my suffering, you know? So for me personally, around this question of race, what's happened with me is I have people in my life who are Black who tell me that they're suffering from racism. So it ceases to become an issue and it becomes more an opportunity for me to bring some relief, for me to stand in solidarity with, for me to try to understand something and to try to be there in places and at times when people I love who are Black are scared or threatened. So I want to share something with you that happened last week. You know, we've had all these protests happening, and clergy in Beverly have been participating in the protests in the last week, and it's been really wonderful. People coming together, masks, you know, car rallies, so not everybody getting out and, you know, mixing up. But in this car rally that we had last week, we were asked to put signs on our cars. So I had this purple construction paper and I cut out all these letters: BLACK, MATTERS, LIVES, Black Lives Matter. I cut those out and I was putting them on the hood of my car right out front where I live, right in front of my house. The morning of the protest, this was last Wednesday morning, and I've lived here for several years in this neighborhood, and I know some of my neighbors, but I want to share with you that I had this sensation as I was putting these letters up and it was becoming apparent what it was spelling. I began to feel afraid. I was afraid that my neighbors were looking out their windows, you know, and that the people who were driving by were somehow angry at me. I felt like I was doing something really controversial.
Mhm.
And I was afraid. I was afraid that someone was going to try to hurt me, that someone was going to desecrate my car. I had to go in to my house for a minute, and I kept looking outside to make sure my car was okay. And I was telling this to my very close friend who's Black, who when I told them, they started laughing and they said, "Now you know how we feel all the time."
Well, I think to relate to that, you know, this is the second show we've done on this particular subject. And I'm not exactly an enthusiastic bell ringer for the problem. I think there's a different problem and a different approach. And I think, as I mentioned last week, I think the police have a terribly difficult job. And especially the good cops that are trying to do the right thing. And I start to wonder sometimes is how is that going to be perceived with the audience? What would the Black community think about that? Would they want to retaliate? Would they want to do something different? So, I mean, I think we all have these feelings of what could be the possible consequences of something.
George, could you just back up, because I didn't quite get it. When you were talking about what would the Black community think of that, what is that you're referring to?
The point I made the last week, and I continue to make, there's no such thing as race.
Mm.
My perception of it is it's an economic problem. And I went through this a little bit last week about the words that show up like Black Mariah and Paddy Wagon that derived from when the Irish were living in the low red district. And they were the major problem that the police were continually working on. Mm-hmm. So it's not the party line. It's not the way that everybody says it. You know, you walk around, went to the market today, and there's a lady there behind the counter, and she's got a mask on, and it's got "I can't breathe" is written across the mask. So there's a lot of people that are taking a lot of personal feelings into this discussion.
Yes.
You start to wonder what would happen, what's possible outcome of some of this stuff.
Yes, George, I hear what you're saying. I hear you use the word retaliate. And so connected with that is some fear. You have some fear, some concern?
I have some concern, obviously, yeah.
Yeah. I think this is really important. How do we work with our fear? You know, because as the Buddha also taught, change is difficult.
Yeah.
But change is. Like, look at you. If you look at ourselves in these screens, I definitely have changed in the last 10 years. I think I've changed in the last 10 days. I see myself aging as we go. Like change happens. This is really, really challenging for us. It's maybe the most difficult thing that we have, that we're not in control of that kind of change. But we can engage in a way, just as you used the word a few minutes ago, we don't have to be victims.
Yeah.
We can be active parties, active agents in the process of change.
As we talked the last session about somebody's got to step up and do something. And I think what we're doing tonight and what we did last week is our attempt to get the story out in a different fashion and present it to maybe a different audience. And maybe it will not go down well with some people, and other people may say, oh yeah, that might be interesting, or that's different. And that's what we're trying to achieve, but the risk is still there.
Yes. Let me tell you something, George, because I'm feeling you tonight. I really feel what you're saying. And I think that the work we're doing, I'm committed to it. You know, yesterday I had to go pick up my car at Subaru. And so they sent a lift to pick me up.
Oh.
I know. And I was nervous about that, you know, but I had my mask and I got in the car and it's this old white guy who's the driver.
Yeah.
And he's got his mask on and he's driving and I'm in the back. We've got the windows open. That's the new policy, you know, to be. But he's trying to talk to me and I can hardly hear what he's saying. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm in the back seat going, yeah. But then all of a sudden I realize he's talking about the protests. And this makes me want to cry, George. He's an old white guy. And in my mind, I'd already summed him up. I'd already put him into a box. And this is what we as Buddhists work with all the time, how our mind categorizes other people. All of us do this.
Oh, yeah.
So, but when he started talking about the protests, it was so beautiful. He was saying, you know, it's time for change. It's not okay that the way we've been treating Black people. It's really time that we all need to wake up. I was so moved by that and I was so humbled by it. So I think that there is something that's happening. He said, I see at these protests now, it's different this time. It's different from the last times we had these protests. I see more diverse people. I see more white people there. More people are joining in with the conversation and taking a stand for, we know it's not right to prevent someone from breathing. We know that's not right.
Yeah.
So
I think what you're getting to is the basic problem that there is a phrase I like to use of pre-judgment.
yes,
Whenever you get into a situation, you have a pre-judgment of what's going on around me, who are these people,
Yep.
what are the possible outcomes.
yes,
Fine. And as you were saying, as the more you talk with this gentleman, oh, my pre-judgment wasn't exactly on track and I have to adjust it.
that's right.
Fine. And I think that's what goes through life. But
Yes.
where the problem comes in is people go in and make a prejudgment and they lock it in and they never change it.
So
And that's
how about
what prejudice is.
for the rest of this conversation, we change the pronoun. We change it from they and you to I. Let's talk about our own personal experience. I've given you 2 stories now of my personal experience of how I'm working with this. And you very bravely said to me last time that you wanted to talk about white privilege, which I'm really fascinated by because you had just said that you don't think that races exist. So if that's the case, then what would we have to talk about if we talk about white privilege?
Well, I think one of the things that I particularly don't like about the phrase white privilege, I feel that people are trying to put me in a guilt trip for something I have absolutely no control over.
Yeah. So George, in addition to when I mentioned beginner's mind a few minutes ago, beginner's mind is our salvation. It means fresh start. It means no guilt, no shame, no fear, just reaching the hand across, extending a hand, you know, opening up having a conversation. So I'm wondering if there's a way, that we could talk with someone who might be willing. I don't know who's willing, but a person of color, like a black person, a black man or a woman next time, who could just share with us their experience. Because for you and me, I think what the most important thing to do is to listen to someone else's experience, and let's see what we can learn. What do you think?
At the same thing, if you want to get into personal experiences, as I mentioned, I was living for a year in a white ghetto in the middle of a black ghetto in the south side of Chicago. So that is a totally different experience than what I grew up with in the outskirts of Providence. And it got to be, in some cases, very threatening. And got into an automobile accident in Chicago. And lo and behold, the guy behind the wheel is of African heritage. The two cops that showed up also of African heritage. I'm driving a car with Texas license plates and a Texas license. And that's when the fun began. So I recognize that, there are situations where, whoops, this is not what I'm prepared to handle. And this could go bad very quickly.
I think you need a friend.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, I'm your friend, first of all. And
Okay.
as someone in the Zen world said, what is a true friend? A true friend is someone who will tell you the truth and not run away.
Okay.
And that's what we're doing.
So what's the truth you're going to tell me?
Oh, no. I'm
Okay.
not that. Just another friend. Because what I'm thinking about is to avoid race and racism or privilege or any of this conversation, whatever you want to have, whatever you want to call it, because we are having a conversation. In order for it to avoid becoming an issue and being more about our humanity, I think we need to humanize it a little bit. I think we need to bring in like real people. And so, for instance, I had an experience at a clergy retreat in Indianapolis several years ago. There were like 300 of us clergy from different denominations, most Christian. I think I was one of just maybe 2 or 3 Buddhists there. There were rabbis and then many Christian ministers. And it was led by Black Christian ministers. Very powerful. And we did an exercise where we made a big circle. We were in this huge banquet hall. And they said, okay, they asked us a series of questions. Step into the middle of the room if like some of the questions were like, if you've ever been on welfare, step into the center of the room. If you own your own house, step into the center of the room. If you've ever been arrested, step into the center of the room. And so this was really interesting to see, different people stepping into the center of the room, and the feelings that arose. Like, I've never owned a house. And I stepped into this, so I didn't get to step into the center of the room, and I felt what I felt, Yeah. But some of the questions there's a couple that I want to bring up right now. That one that really stayed with me was, step into the center of the room if in the last week you've received a text or a phone call from someone from a different race than yours. And I think that's the homework I'm going to give you this week, George. That you start texting with someone from a different race. Like, start having a friendship. Like, start getting to know someone. Start caring about them. Start thinking about them. Start wondering about them. Start talking with them, in real time. And let's see if you could start answering that question by yes, that you could step in the center of the room, that yes, you are beginning to interact with people outside of your usual scene. We're all talking about the bubble, how we're in a bubble and it's not serving anybody.
Well, I think that's one of the major problems the Y being shut down. The diversity of people that show up there and people I engage with, and my particular shtick is I go around with a list of jokes. And I love to do this to people. They look and they're really straining at some particular exercise machine. And I'll say, you need some words of wisdom. And I slide a bunch of jokes under their nose and they look at me and I walk away. And then I'll look back after they've read the first two or three and they're grinning and they're still looking at me like strange. And it's a great way to engage with people. I think it works for me.
So go deeper. Go deeper.
Well,
We can't do this now, but one of the other questions was, have you had anybody in your home for dinner who's of a different race? Ever? Not even in the last week, but just ever.
Will Chinese count as a different race?
Yes, it does.
Japanese. I got a daughter-in-law is Japanese. She's here all the time. So
Okay.
yeah. So
Well, let's up the ante then. We're going to do the advanced round. Since we're right now focusing on Black people,
Yep.
because there is a particular legacy with Black people around slavery, and around what's happening right now. There are 2 Black men now who have been killed at the hands of the police, each of them saying, "I can't breathe." So maybe let's focus on Black people.
what's the second one?
Eric Garner in New York
Oh yeah, the guy selling cigarettes.
3 years ago.
Yeah.
So, so that's the homework, George, for you and me. The next time that we talk, that we are texting or phone calling or going for a walk with someone who's Black. And then when we come back together, we're going to talk about how that was and what we talked about.
It's going to be a long time before we get together. The Y doesn't open until the 29th.
Well, then you gotta Achtung, hop to it. You gotta figure it out. I can point you in some directions if you'd like. See, because the point of this is, I think what this work is asking us to do is to let our lives change, to be willing, back to that beginner's mind.
Yeah.
Being so open that we're willing to let our point of view shift a little bit as we become more familiar with the actual human beings involved.
Okay.
George, you're just adorable. I want the whole world. All right, here's one more story. Have I ever told you the story about my dad when I was in El Salvador? Did I tell you that? I can't remember. My dad was a lifelong Republican. He died in 2015. We're from New Hampshire. When I was 25, I went to El Salvador. It was during the Civil War. And I was on a delegation of accompaniment. It's kind of the work I'm doing now, only I wasn't a priest back then. And I came back from El Salvador and I wrote my experiences down in like a report. And then I sent it to everybody I knew, including my dad. And my dad, a couple weeks later, called me one night and he said, "Joan, I just want you to know, I watched the news tonight. And when the news about El Salvador, because this was in the early 90s, when the Civil War was still going on, when the news came on and they were talking about El Salvador, for the first time, I thought about the people instead of thinking about U.S. strategic interests there." Mm-hmm. And that's the whole point, George. One world, one humanity. That's really, I think, where we can feel our connectedness. And it's no longer about being the good guy or the bad guy or being afraid of retaliation, that just we're all on the same side. We're all struggling together. And when I feel that with my people in my life, my friends who I love who are Black, it feels so good to be on their side, to be with them. I want to help them. I want to be of help. I don't want to perpetuate the suffering in the world. So maybe I'll share that tomorrow we're going to be meeting with the mayor and some members of the city council to begin to see what can happen. If we can take some tangible steps in Beverly, within this problem of racism. Because, George, I would love to see Beverly be known as the model city we're really having the deep conversations and we're moving forward with this problem.
Okay, if you want to get into that thinking of what Beverly can do, I've got a complaint about the way this planning is going for the Plan Beverly and the way the planning is going on Rantoul Street. Consider that all they're building down there is apartments for expats out of Boston who can't afford to live in Boston. That's fine. Except when you start to think about, well, are they going to bring the virus with them when they come here? And we crowd them into these apartment houses along Rantoul Street. And my other complaint about this thing is, it's all well and good to build $2,000 and $3,000 and $4,000 a month apartments, but the people that work in the city, that make this a vibrant city, they're making minimum wage, which is either 12 and a quarter or 12.75. And we had a discussion with Councilor Guanci, Paul Guanci, and he mentioned that the people that work in his sub shop are coming from almost the New Hampshire border to work there because they can't afford to live in Beverly.
Yeah.
So we've got a one-sided plan that's going to continue to perpetuate the situation where we have a very narrow focus on the kind of people that are here.
So
And we're
George,
not taking care of the people who are working here.
I appreciate that. And I know you brought this up last time as this comprehensive issue, and it's true. In Buddhism, we talk about the truth of interdependence, that you can't really talk about anything in a vacuum, that everything impacts and is impacted by everything else. And I'm going to call that a major digression. I'm going to bring us back to what we were talking about, because there were a couple points, and we might be running short on time, but I have a couple questions for you on this piece that you shared with me by this man, Shola Richards. Around understanding white privilege.
Yep.
He says, understand white privilege. Having white privilege doesn't mean that your life isn't difficult. It simply means that your skin color isn't one of the things contributing to your life difficulties.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, that's the first point he makes. The
Yep.
second point he makes is, don't say all lives matter.
That's where I get off the bus to Saskatchewan.
Okay, hold on, hold that thought. Because he says, responding to Black Lives Matter by saying all lives matter is insensitive, tone deaf, and dumb.
Okay.
All lives can't matter until Black lives matter. And then he says, this is interesting.
But this protest that has turned into a riot has killed too many people of all different shades of color, black, white, and everything in between. So Black Lives Matter, for one point of view, is that started the riots, and now we've got at least half a dozen, if not many more.
That's not true. That's incorrect.
What is incorrect?
That Black Lives Matter started the riots. That is incorrect.
Depends on what you read, and you can either throw them into it.
No, the Black Lives, we talked about this last time. The Black Lives, I wish that you'd done your research on this. The Black Lives Matter people in Los Angeles tried to stop the rioting. We talked about this last time.
Some did, some didn't. It's very difficult to make general statements about this.
Yeah, so maybe we should avoid doing that. And that's why we're
Yeah.
saying all lives matter is one of those general statements. We're talking about something very specific.
Yeah, okay.
So he brings the point up, if I broke my ankle playing basketball and I went to the doctor for medical attention and his response was, all bones matter, and then sent me home, that would be pretty dismissive. Yes, my ribs, my wrist, and my skull all matter. That's obvious. But right now, It's my effing ankle that's broken and in need of immediate attention. Because as you've pointed out, there's a broader issue here around housing, around employment, what you just mentioned about Paul Guanci's sub shop. You know, people of color working lower paid jobs who can't even live in the immediate vicinity. It doesn't make any sense at all. So
Exactly.
This is the point he's making.
Getting it.
Yes. So this is exact, but are you getting it, George? Are you making this connection when we get really specific and we say Black Lives Matter, not a generalization of all lives matter? Of course, life matters.
Yes.
Life matters. But his point is that we're devaluing human life when we devalue any one human life.
True. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what
That's
I mean
the
by
point.
all lives matter.
That is
Go one step further. His analogy breaks down when you start to say, what is the problem? Had he been in an auto accident, had several broken bones and a punctured lung and a few other things, his broken ankle would not be high on the list of things to
This
fix.
is not hypothetical.
No, it is.
No, in his example,
This is where I disagree, because the problem is bigger than just Black lives. Lots of people are getting abused by the police. And yes, a good percentage of them are of African origin. Another good percent of them are of Hispanic background. But even larger percentage are white. So it's not just one particular group.
George,
it's a bigger problem.
you know the reality that it's disproportionate based on the numbers in the general population, the people who are in prison.
I understand that. I've had enough
These
statistics.
are like
I've had enough statistics to understand that game. And it's
Well, George, let's move on to the next one because I'm curious. He says reverse racism is not real. While racism is real, reverse racism is not. Please don't use that term ever.
No, it's really called affirmative action.
What is reverse racism?
I don't know either, but what I think he's talking about is you fail to recognize affirmative action has been used. And affirmative action, what irritates me about that, it's very selective as to who is a minority that needs to be affirmed. And I've watched too many discussions over layoffs and also the situation in California, especially where Orientals have to have a much higher SAT score to get accepted into schools than whites and or other shades of brown. So that, I think, is something he's missing the point on.
If you're white, be an ally. In order for racism to get, did you say yeah?
Yeah, I agree with that, yeah.
That's wonderful, George. I would
That's
never.
what we're doing tonight.
What is it that we're doing tonight?
We're having a discussion. We're trying to inform people of what the issues are and what the perceptions are.
What do you think it means? What do you think it means to be an ally, a white ally?
Depends on what the situation is.
All right, I got one for you. Let's get specific. Tomorrow, 2:00, Beverly High School.
Okay.
You like to walk?
Not really. No, I got arthritis in both knees.
Okay.
And my game right now is the reason I'm going to physical therapy is to get everything else fixed so that I can go.
All right, George. The most important thing here, the body. Take care of the body. So within that, taking care of the body, how about showing up? Drive. You can park over in your BevCam parking spot and just be there. That's where the march is going to start. It's being organized by the Beverly High School students.
I know. I get the emails.
Oh yeah. Okay. Will you be there? I'll be there.
No.
Why not? I thought you wanted to be a white ally.
Well, that's your definition of an ally. It's not my
definition. What's your definition? What do you think it means to be a white ally?
In a situation where something is happening to step up. Like I talked about last week, the people that are willing to step up in a situation.
Like what? What people?
Anybody that's there. It's not, I don't want to get this into segregating characters by any simple parameter. Back to my point of, yes, you make a prejudgment when you're in a situation, and you continually adjust that perception as you get smarter and you continue the discussion or the event, and don't lock into it as being, okay, that explains everything.
Right. Okay. So my question here is, we've had this conversation tonight. We've talked. We've listened. What have we learned?
I think we understand each other differently. We have continued to agree to disagree.
Don't speak for me, please. Don't use the word we. I don't want to be spoken for. Please speak for yourself.
I understand you a little better. I know where you're coming from.
Okay.
Hopefully, you have a better perception of where I'm coming from. We haven't changed our opinion yet. We haven't gotten to the point of what is the real issue.
So
That's my perception.
I want to get real specific. What I learned tonight about you is that you have fear around this question of racism. And that really opens my heart to you. That really softens my heart. You're afraid of retaliation among Black people toward white people.
Yeah, that is a real risk, yes.
Well, it's a real concern that you have.
It is what's going on in all these cities right now. These protests are turning into riots. And people are getting burned out. One of the ones that really irritated me, there was a YouTube video of a half-hour presentation by Tucker Carlson. And I started watching that. And he has some very dramatic film in there of the aftermaths and some of the existing situations during these riots. I couldn't watch it. It is too upsetting. I'd had a tough time this afternoon just reading the transcript of it. So,
George, it is very upsetting what's happening, but I want to bring it right back to what you and I are talking about. Would you please get specific and tell me what you learned about me specifically in this conversation? I really want to hear it.
Well, you've got a mindset of it's strictly a Black problem. And I don't agree with that. I think the problem is bigger than that.
Wait, what do you mean a Black problem?
It's a situation where the Blacks are the only ones being affected.
That's not what I feel.
That's what
I'm glad we're checking.
No, you asked me what I'm interpreting you to say.
No, I asked you what you learned about me.
That's what I learned about you.
But I'm really glad we're checking this out, because if you walk away thinking that, that is not understanding me. I want to be heard. I want to be understood. I don't feel understood or heard right now.
Okay.
I feel like a false conclusion has been drawn. And that makes me feel, I feel a lot of pain around that. So maybe we can try again. Is there something else that you felt in something that I said that you learned about where I'm coming from?
Well, you are persistent in presenting this thing from a Black perspective. And I think that's too narrow a perspective on the real situation.
Well, you know, back to that ankle thing, maybe it's too narrow for the doctor to focus just on the ankle, but that's where the problem was in that moment.
If that's
we can
all,
talk about Rantoul Street.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. The problem is only the ankle. In my perception is the victim that comes into the hospital has been in an auto accident. and is a lot more damaged than strictly the ankle.
But what do? Do you sit there and you talk about the philosophy of it, or do you attend to the actual suffering of the patient in front of you?
You tend to, that's what triage is called. What is the biggest problem? And I don't think...
When you have a suffering person in front of you, what do you do?
Is he breathing? That's the first question you ask. Is he bleeding? Next question.
And what if the answer is yes, he's bleeding? What do you do?
Stop the bleeding.
Great. Yes. Ding, 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 ding. That's called ending on a high note. I feel met now hearing you say that. That's what I'm talking about, is stopping the bleeding. That's all.
Yeah. And my point is, there are more people bleeding than simply the blacks.
But who is bleeding right now? There's a lot of pain being expressed right now. As white people, we're either going to hear it and respond or not. Yes, exactly. Exhaling. Well, we have a lot of work to do, but fortunately...
Where we have a major disagreement, a disconnect, is I'm a number merchant by trade. And when I start to look at how many people are getting killed in this country, I got an article out of The Economist magazine this afternoon. There have been something like 7,000 people killed by the police since 2013. Most of them are white. That's a big problem.
So you have issues around police brutality?
Police procedures, yes, I do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well...
And part of the problem is, if we look at the situation with George Floyd, for instance, do you really believe that the 4 cops involved in that thing were like D'Artagnan and the 3 Musketeers, and they had a pact beforehand, all for one and one for all, and we're going to go out and kill ourselves a black person this afternoon? Do you think that's how it started?
I'm always suspicious of questions that begin with the phrase, do you really think?
Okay.
I'm pleading the fifth.
So,
George, I have to just say, it's almost 6 o'clock and we got to sit zazen pretty soon. I would like to just say to you, I would like to invite you, because these are stressful times. Would you like to join us for meditation tonight?
No.
All right, freely offered, but I gotta head out in a minute.
Okay. Want to do it again?
Well, I think we have a lot to talk about, and you have homework. We both have homework.
Yeah.
We're gonna report back who we've been texting with or having phone calls with, someone from a new black friend. It sounds really kind of like kindergarten, but make a new black friend. And I'm going to send some referrals along to you.
Okay.
Some people who might, to engage with in real time.
And why don't you get one to join us next time?
You'd like me to invite someone, a black person, to see if they'd like to join us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned that point that we should have some other people on this discussion than just you and me.
Well, I have mentioned that.
We're both talking about it from an abstract point of view. And what I think you made the point earlier is we ought to get a real point of view.
Well, I happen to be of the mind that there's some work to do before we start inflicting ourselves on black people.
Okay.
Thank you for your good humor. So I think next week, let's just come back to you and me. There may be 1 or 2 other people from Zen Center's social justice group. What do you think about that?
Fine.
Yeah, a couple people expressed interest. So I think I will invite them to come in and we'll open it up a little bit. But I've said to them, this is not about ganging up on anybody. So these are all very nice, gentle Zen people.
I haven't had a good fight since I quit playing hockey, so I'm up for it.
Okay, George. Thank you so much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned for the next round. We'll be back.
Ding, ding.